Imagine leaning your back against a fuel tank while riding into combat in a vehicle so uncomfortable it feels like Satan himself designed it. Now add 40 rounds for the main gun sitting right next to it, an armor thin enough that pretty much anything heavier than a rifle round could go through it. Those were just some of the problems if you were unlucky enough to be inside a BMP. So today we're going to tell you how it got this bad. After World War II, Soviet mechanized infantry had a problem. Two problems, actually. Their soldiers that needed to follow tanks were riding into battle on trucks, so this meant they were fully exposed to enemy fire. And an even bigger problem, as the safety of the soldiers was never really top priority anyway, was that trucks couldn't keep up with the tanks on rough terrain because they didn't have tracks. So the first attempt to fix this was the BTR-152, which showed up in 1950. BTR, by the way, in Russian stands for Armored Transporter, and BMP stands for Infantry Fighting Vehicle. Pretty much like the Western designations APC, Armored Personnel Carrier, and IFV, Infantry Fighting Vehicle. But you'll hear more on that to make it clear for you guys that maybe didn't know it, to not get confused. So the BTR-152 was basically an armoured hull bolted onto a truck chassis. It gave you some protection, but it was still a wheeled vehicle trying to keep pace with tracked tanks across rough terrain, and it wasn't really good at it. Then in 1957, they came up with the BTR-50, which was tracked this time, built on the PT-76 light tank chassis, so cross-country mobility improved. But the early versions were open-topped, troops had to climb over the sides to get out, and the only weapon on it was a machine gun. They eventually put a roof on it, but the other problems stayed. And then, in 1960, you get the BTR-60, an 8x8 wheeled vehicle. And this one really summed up the problem Soviet planners were dealing with. All of these vehicles did the same thing. They were what's called a battle taxi. You drive the infantry close to the front, they get out, and the vehicle backs off. And in a conventional war, that may work, but the Soviets weren't preparing for a conventional war. So here's where it gets interesting, and here's where the entire BMP story really begins. NATO had a problem of its own in Central Europe. They were outnumbered. The Soviets had more tanks, more artillery, more infantry. And NATO's answer to this was tactical nuclear weapons to level the playing field. The Soviets knew this, and they fully expected that any future war in Europe would involve widespread nuclear strikes on both sides. And if this is your starting assumption, everything about how you move infantry changes. Because if you're a soldier standing in the open on irradiated ground, exposed to chemical agents and blast effects, you're not going to last. A battle taxi that drops you off and drives away doesn't solve your problem anymore, because now you need to stay inside. So this nuclear assumption created three requirements for a new vehicle, and nothing the Soviets had at the time could meet even one of them properly. First, infantry needed a vehicle that was hermetically sealed, overpressurized, with NBC filtration, so they could survive and operate on contaminated terrain. Second, nuclear weapons made it suicidal to mass large formations together, because you're just giving the enemy one convenient target. You had to spread out across wide frontages, but when you spread out, you dilute your firepower. So the solution was to give even a single squad its own organic fire support, something more powerful than just a machine gun that could even kill tanks and fortifications if needed. And third, infantry had to be able to fight from inside the vehicle without ever opening a hatch. Now here's the irony. By the time the BMP actually entered service, this whole nuclear battlefield scenario was already becoming less likely to happen. But the vehicle was designed around it anyway, and those design choices would stick around for decades to haunt its unfortunate crew and soldiers driving inside. So to fulfill this nuclear protection thing, firing ports were needed, so soldiers could shoot from inside without breaking the seal. They also wanted armor that stops small arms, and preferably up to 20mm autocannon fire across the frontal arc, plus amphibious capability, because the Soviets were obsessed with that after their river-crossing experiences in World War II. Then they wanted room for 7 to 10 soldiers plus the crew of the vehicle, and it all had to be cheap and simple. What they were basically describing was a new category of military equipment, something that combined an APC and a light tank into one vehicle. Several designs competed, and the winner was eventually Object 765, soon to become the BMP-1. And it was the only design that managed to fulfill virtually all of the requirements at the same time. The key was the front engine layout. By placing the engine at the front right of the hull, with the driver at front left, you free up the entire rear for a troop compartment with 2 rear exit doors. Infantry can dismount quickly out of the back with some protection. Directly behind the driver, also on the left, was the vehicle commander, so those two were basically in tandem. The gunner sat alone in the one-man turret, and behind the turret, you had the troop compartment for 8 infantry soldiers. 8 guys on 2 padded benches running along the center of the vehicle, back to back, facing outward toward the hull walls. And between those 2 rows of benches, functioning as their shared backrest, sat the main fuel tank. 330 litres of fuel, plus the vehicle batteries and electrical equipment, right there in the middle of the infantry compartment. That's what you're leaning against. What could go wrong, right? Additional fuel was carried inside the hollow rear exit doors. The reasoning was that in the kind of large-scale European offensive the Soviets were planning for, hits to the rear were statistically unlikely. But combat reality in Afghanistan, the Middle East, and Chechnya didn't follow the statistics, as you're about to hear. Standing instructions said to drain the rear door tanks in combat zones and fill them with sand, but this was rarely actually done. Each soldier faced outward toward the hull side, so they could use their weapons through those firing ports we mentioned. The idea was that soldiers could attach special fume extractors and spent cartridge deflectors to their AKMs or AK-74s, stick the weapon into a ball-mounted port in the hull wall, and fire from inside while staying completely sealed behind armor. A rubber gasket around each port maintained the NBC seal. Each port had a periscope vision block above it, so you could see what you were shooting at, and a hose and deflector assembly clipped onto each weapon to draw the fumes out and keep hot brass from hitting the guy next to you. There were 4 ports on each side and 1 in the left rear door, 9 total, plus 4 large D-shaped hatches in the roof, so troops could stand up and fire RPGs. The main armament was the 73mm Grom, a smooth-bore gun that fired rocket-assisted grenades, chosen because it could theoretically destroy any NATO armored vehicle of the time. Theoretically is the key word here, because it had no stabilizer, so it couldn't fire accurately on the move, and accuracy dropped horribly beyond about 500 meters. It had an autoloader with 40 rounds for the main gun, which sat neatly inside the crew compartment and just in front of the fuel tank that the infantry were leaning their backs against. Just a perfect scenario in case you sent this vehicle somewhere like, I don't know, a war. On top of the gun barrel sat an anti-tank guided missile, AT-3 Saga, on a rail. The operator had to physically steer the missile to the target with a thumbstick while visually tracking it the entire flight. Doing this inside a tiny one-man turret under combat stress was about as practical as it sounds. And to reload the missile, you'd need to open a small roof hatch on the turret, which broke the NBC seal that the entire vehicle was designed around. The theory behind all of this was sound. In practice, it was nearly useless. On top of that, the compartment was so cramped that effectively aiming through those vision blocks was extremely difficult. So what soon happened in reality is what you'd expect. The BMPs were used as simple troop taxis, the same role as the APCs they were specifically designed to replace, with being amphibious basically the only real improvement, but now within a much more expensive and complicated vehicle. The BMP had a very low silhouette, under 2 meters tall, which is great for not getting hit, but terrible for the people inside, so they cut down troop capacity from 8 to 6 most of the time. It was initially deployed in limited numbers, reserved only for units expected to fight NATO in Western Europe. Everyone else kept their wheeled BTRs. Now the armour. The BMP-1 hull is welded from rolled steel armour plate, although there's a common misconception that it's aluminum. It's not. Maximum frontal thickness is about 33 millimeters at a steep slope, sides are 14 to 19 millimeters, and the turret is 23 millimeters. Across the 60-degree frontal arc, it stops 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds. Sides and rear protect only against small arms and shell fragments. And this was a deliberate trade-off. They needed the vehicle to swim, propelled by its tracks at about 8 kilometers per hour. They needed the weight down to roughly 13 tons, and they needed 65 kilometers per hour on roads to keep pace with tank formations. Something had to give, and what gave was protection. However, when the BMP-1 was first shown to the world at a parade on Red Square in Moscow, it caused the West to poop their pants a little. At that time, NATO armies were using APCs like the M113 and FV432 as standard infantry transport, and nothing like the BMP, or infantry fighting vehicle, existed on the western side. That directly kicked off accelerated Western MIFV program that would produce the German Marder, the American M2 Bradley, and the British Warrior. As for total production of the BMP-1, it reached roughly 40,000 units across all producers, making it the most produced infantry fighting vehicle in history. It was exported to about 50 countries, spanning the Warsaw Pact, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. The BMP-1's first real combat came in October 1973, when Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. Egypt had received its first batch of just 80 BMP-1s only 2 months before the war started, and initially, both armies actually praised the vehicle. The speed, the maneuverability, the low ground pressure, these were all working as intended. Egyptian BMPs navigated the northern Kantara salt marshes, where tanks would have bogged down. The amphibious capability proved useful during the Suez Canal crossing, and the ATGMs contributed to the devastating toll on Israeli armor in the opening days of the war. But the problems showed up fast. The gun was only effective within about 500 meters. The rounds were low velocity, rocket-assisted, and they drifted off target in any crosswind. No stabilizer meant accurate fire on the move was impossible. Side and rear armor turned out to be vulnerable to Israeli 50 caliber machine gun fire. And the desert heat created another problem, because with no air conditioning, temperatures inside quickly became unbearable. Crews were keeping roof hatches open even in combat, which of course exposed them to machine gun fire and air bursts. Soviet technical teams traveled to Syria after the war to collect combat data, and what they found launched the BMP modernization program. By 1974, development of the BMP-2 was already underway. So the BMP-2 brought some significant improvements. The biggest one was the new two-man turret, which moved the commander out of the hull and up next to the gunner. This solved the BMP-1's problem, where the commander and driver sat in tandem, meaning a single mine could, and often did, kill both of them. The new 30mm autocannon could elevate to plus 74 degrees, which was extremely important for mountain warfare, as you're going to hear. It had dual feed for rapid switching between high explosive and armor-piercing ammunition, and it was stabilized for accurate fire on the move. The ATGM system was also upgraded to the AT-5 Conquers, but what the BMP-2 didn't fix turned out to be just as important. They kept the same basic hull and chassis with all the flaws we mentioned earlier. Then came the war in Afghanistan, and the first real horrors for the crews of BMPs were about to be shown. The Soviet army entered Afghanistan in December 1979, equipped almost entirely with BMP-1s, while the BMP-2 still existed as pretty much just prototypes. And over 9 years of mountain guerrilla warfare, every design compromise in that vehicle was exposed. Russian soldiers came up with a new meaning for the BMP acronym, Bratskaya Mogila Pekhoti, which translates literally to Brotherhood Grave of Infantry, so it doesn't hint at a really great experience. RPG vulnerability was catastrophic, with 95% of hits penetrating the armor wherever the hit might be, and pretty much any RPG hit destroyed the whole vehicle and killed everyone inside. If you remember how the fuel and ammo were stored inside, you'd get that the shaped charged jet burned through the armor and basically couldn't miss the fuel tank inside. So seconds after a hit, there goes the fuel first, and soon after the ammo as well, and the whole thing together with everyone inside goes into the air. The knockout rate in combat for BMPs was so low because they were most likely going to be completely destroyed beyond repair, and hardly anyone had a chance of bailing out in time. Now add to this the steeply sloped lower glacis that would deflect tilt rod mines along the bottom until they were directly under the chassis before detonating. Drivers in Afghanistan started laying sandbags, body armor vests, and steel plates under their seats as improvised protection against the IED threat. The gun was useless in the mountains, with an elevation limit of 15 degrees where it simply couldn't engage Mujahideen positions on the mountain ridgelines above the valleys Soviet convoys were passing through. Crews improvised as much as they could, mounting anti-aircraft guns in place of turrets and using ZSU-23 Shilka anti-aircraft vehicles repurposed for ground suppression. At this point, BMP-2 production began at full steam, and they were rushed to Afghanistan to stop the massacre of the BMP-1. Troops especially praised the BMP-2's 30mm autocannon's high elevation angles that finally let them shoot back at targets on high ground. And this is where something started that would define BMP operations for the next 4 decades. Riding on top. Infantry chose to ride on the hull rather than inside the vehicle. That's because an RPG or IED hit while you're inside meant near certain death, while riding on the outside at least gave you a chance of being thrown off by the blast. Total Soviet losses in Afghanistan reached over 1,300 armoured vehicles of all types, with roughly 14,000 military personnel killed overall. Then, Desert Storm in 1991 provided probably the most direct designed philosophy comparison between the Western and Eastern thinking. The American M2 Bradley, which was developed directly as a response to the BMP-1, was now going up against the vehicle it was designed to defeat. However, the technological gap was devastating. Bradley thermal sights could identify targets beyond 3,000 meters in the dark through sandstorms and smoke. Iraqi BMP-1 optics were effective to about 900 meters, using active infrared, which revealed the BMP's position to anyone with thermal viewers. Bradleys were engaging Iraqi BMPs before the Iraqis even knew they were there. The BMPs, sitting in their dug-in positions, were killed systematically. A Russian study would later show that the 25mm armor-piercing, discarding sabot round of the Bradley's gun gave double the penetration of the BMP-2's 30mm round. So, the BMP-3 was supposed to be Russia's definitive answer, with all the lessons they learned the hard way, and its design lineage this time traces back to a light tank that was never built. Object 685 was an amphibious light tank armed with a 100mm gun, intended to replace the aging PT-76. When that program was cancelled, the chassis was repurposed for a next-generation BMP, built around an entirely new weapons system that combined a 100mm gun/launcher, a 30mm autocannon, and a coaxial PKT machine gun in a single turret mounting. This became the BMP-3, arguably the most heavily armed infantry fighting vehicle ever fielded. The 100mm gun could fire both high-explosive fragmentation rounds and laser beam-riding ATGMs. But the BMP-3 arrived at the worst possible time. Only about 250 vehicles were made before the Soviet Union collapsed. Production continued under the Russian Federation, but total output reached only somewhere around 2,000 units, compared to the tens of thousands of BMP-1s and 2s. And if you think that the BMP-3 finally solved all the horrors for people riding inside, well, think again. It only made it worse. Because of its light tank ancestry, the engine sat in the rear, which meant infantry had to go through 2 tunnel-like passages over the engine compartment to get out, and jump nearly a meter to the ground. Ammunition was still stored the same way inside the crew compartment. The hull and turret were made of aluminum alloy, with steel plate welded over critical areas. And when aluminum gets hit by shaped charges, it burns and melts into the crew compartment even worse than steel. Fuel was stored in the front hull, and one well-placed hit stood between the crew and the other world. The Russia-Ukraine war, now past its 3rd year, has produced BMP losses on an industrial scale like nothing before it. Russia's total armoured vehicle losses stand at roughly 14,000 units, with BMPs of all types making up a major portion of that number. FPV kamikaze drones have become the dominant armour killer, and BMPs are not faring any better. And the practice of riding on top continues more than 4 decades after it started in Afghanistan. There are improvisations like external troop compartments welded onto BMP hulls, basically large makeshift boxes mounted on the roof because soldiers refuse to ride inside the troop compartment. The Kurganets 25 was supposed to fix all of this, which is a 25-ton next-generation BMP that answered every lesson Russia should have learned, but serial production never happened. They eventually decided to just shelve the whole program and instead upgrade existing BMP-2s to the BMP-2M standard. So after decades of crews burning inside these vehicles, there is pretty much no solution in sight.